I speak today not merely as a constitutional monarch, nor solely as a custodian of tradition, but as a fellow human being who has spent a lifetime observing the delicate threads that bind civilizations together, and it is in this spirit of reflection and humility that I address recent public discourse sparked by unexpected words spoken about Islam, words that prompted silence not because they shocked for the sake of noise, but because they invited thought. And in that silence I found an opportunity to speak from the heart, for Islam is not a stranger to history, nor is it foreign to the moral architecture upon which many societies, including our own, have been built. It is a faith of profound depth, intellectual rigor, and spiritual beauty, one that for over 14 centuries has guided countless men and women toward discipline, charity, patience, and an unwavering sense of accountability before the divine. And when I reflect upon Islam, I do not see a monolith or a caricature. I see a civilization that safeguarded knowledge when much of the world lay in darkness, a civilization that preserved philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and ethics, and later returned these treasures to humanity enriched, refined, and illuminated. And I see in Islam a reverence for learning that commands believers to read, to reflect, to seek wisdom from cradle to grave. And I see a moral framework that insists upon justice even when it is difficult, mercy even when power could allow otherwise, and charity not as an occasional gesture, but as an obligation embedded into daily life. For the concept of zakat alone reflects a social conscience that recognizes wealth as a trust rather than an entitlement, a principle that modern societies continue to grapple with. And when one examines the Islamic emphasis on family, on respect for parents, on care for the elderly, on kindness to neighbors regardless of faith, and on the sanctity of human dignity, one cannot honestly deny the universal values it champions, values that resonate deeply with my own long-held belief that faith, when practiced sincerely, should elevate character and soften the heart, not harden it. And I have met Muslims across continents, from scholars to artisans, from farmers to physicians, and in them I have witnessed a quiet devotion expressed not in slogans but in conduct, in honesty in trade, in hospitality to strangers, in patience in adversity, and in gratitude in moments of ease. And it is this lived Islam, this Islam of everyday virtue, that deserves recognition rather than suspicion. And yet I am aware that in our modern age, Islam is often spoken about through the narrow lens of fear, stripped of context and burdened with the actions of those who neither represent its teachings nor embody its ethics. And it is here that I feel compelled to say that no faith should be judged by its transgressors, but by its principles, just as no nation should be defined solely by its darkest chapters. And Islam's principles, when read sincerely, speak repeatedly of peace as a divine ideal, of life as sacred, and of humanity as one family created from a single soul. And there is something profoundly humbling in the Islamic rhythm of daily prayer, a reminder woven into the fabric of time that life is not merely about accumulation, but about alignment of intention, action, and conscience. And I find particular admiration in the Islamic insistence on balance between the material and the spiritual, between individual rights and communal responsibility, between reason and revelation, a balance that our fractured world desperately seeks. And as someone who has long advocated for interfaith harmony, I must emphasize that understanding Islam does not require abandoning one's own beliefs. Rather, it requires listening without prejudice and engaging without fear, for dialogue does not weaken identity. It strengthens it by grounding it in knowledge rather than assumption, and I would also like to acknowledge the Islamic tradition of environmental stewardship, the concept of humanity as caretakers of the earth, entrusted, not entitled, a notion that aligns closely with my own lifelong concerns regarding sustainability and the moral duty to protect creation for future generations. And when Islam teaches that wastefulness is disliked by God, and that even excess in water during ablution is discouraged, it offers a spiritual foundation for ecological responsibility that modern policy alone struggles to inspire. And so when voices from unexpected quarters speak thoughtfully about Islam, it should not provoke outrage nor blind praise, but reflection on why such words resonate, why they silence rooms, and why they invite reconsideration. And my reaction, if it can be called that, is one of measured respect and hope, respect for a faith that has endured scrutiny yet continues to guide millions toward purpose, and hope that such moments of pause may open doors to more honest conversations, conversations where Islam is neither exoticized nor vilified, but understood as a living faith, practiced by ordinary people striving, as all people do, for meaning, morality, and peace. And I believe sincerely that when Islam is approached with fairness, its emphasis on compassion, justice, humility, and remembrance of God offers not a threat to the modern world, but a contribution to it, a reminder that progress without ethics is hollow, and freedom without responsibility is fragile. And it is my earnest wish that we move beyond sound bites and suspicions toward a future where faiths are not weapons in cultural conflicts, but bridges of understanding. And if my words today achieve anything, I hope they affirm to Muslims everywhere that their faith, when lived with sincerity and wisdom, deserves respect, and that Islam, far from being a religion of silence, has much to say to a world that is finally learning the value of listening. As I continue these reflections, I feel it is essential to speak not only of principles but of responsibility, because in moments when the world grows louder with division, silence must be filled with wisdom rather than fear. And I believe Islam offers precisely that wisdom when one looks beyond headlines and listens to its core teachings. For Islam consistently calls upon the human being to refine the self before judging the other, to correct one's own conduct before condemning the world. And this inward discipline, known as self-accountability, is a concept that modern societies often neglect despite its transformative power. And I find it remarkable that Islam frames moral excellence not as a public performance, but as a private covenant between the individual and God, reminding believers that integrity unseen is more valuable than praise heard. And when one studies Islamic history with honesty, one encounters eras where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived not merely side by side, but intellectually intertwined, translating texts, sharing marketplaces, and debating philosophy with mutual respect. And while history, like all human endeavor, is not free from conflict, it would be unjust to ignore the centuries in which Islamic civilization served as centers of coexistence, learning, and cultural flourishing. And it is this historical memory that challenges the simplistic narratives of incompatibility that so often dominate public discourse today. And I must say plainly that fear thrives on ignorance, whereas understanding disarms it, and Islam, when approached with sincerity, invites understanding rather than demands submission of thought, for it repeatedly urges reflection, questioning, and contemplation of the natural world as signs pointing toward a higher moral order, and I am particularly moved by Islam's insistence that intention matters as much as action, that charity without sincerity is hollow, and worship without compassion is incomplete, a teaching that resonates deeply with the UN. Universal human struggle to align outward behavior with inner conscience, and in a world increasingly driven by image rather than substance, this emphasis on intention offers a corrective that is both spiritual and ethical, and I have observed that many Muslims, often quietly and without recognition, embody this ethic through service, caring for the vulnerable, feeding the hungry, educating the young, and offering refuge to the displaced, not because it enhances reputation, but because it is considered an act of devotion. And such acts remind us that faith, at its best, manifests not in argument, but in service. And it would be remiss of me not to address the younger generation, who are often exposed to fragmented portrayals of Islam, shaped more by algorithms than understanding. And to them I say that no tradition can be fairly judged through fragments alone. Islam, like any profound worldview, requires patience to comprehend, humility to approach, and honesty to evaluate. And I believe that when young minds encounter Islam beyond stereotypes, they often discover a faith that speaks powerfully about purpose, discipline, gratitude, and resilience, qualities that are increasingly scarce yet desperately needed in our age of distraction. And there is also a quiet dignity in Islam's rhythm of life. The structured pauses for prayer, the annual fasting that cultivates empathy for the less fortunate, and the communal gatherings that dissolve social hierarchies. reminding the wealthy and the poor alike that before God all stand equal, and this insistence on equality before the divine carries a profound social message, one that challenges arrogance, racism, and inherited privilege. And as someone born into an institution defined by tradition, I can appreciate the courage required to uphold a principle that levels all distinctions before a higher moral law. And it is precisely this aspect of Islam that deserves thoughtful engagement rather than dismissal, and when public figures speak unexpectedly about Islam with nuance, it often unsettles audiences because it disrupts comfortable assumptions. Yet disruption, when guided by reason, is not a threat but an invitation to grow, and my response to such moments is not to amplify controversy but to encourage depth, to ask not whether such words surprise us, but why they do, and what unexamined beliefs they reveal. And I firmly believe that Islam's voice in the global conversation is not one that seeks dominance, but one that offers perspective, a reminder that technological progress without moral grounding risks losing its soul, and that prosperity without gratitude breeds emptiness, and Islam's constant call to remember God, to remember death, and to remember accountability is not a message of fear, but of clarity about what ultimately matters when titles fade and applause falls silent. And if our world is to move forward with wisdom rather than haste, it must learn to listen to such reminders wherever they emerge. And I would like to affirm that respect for Islam does not require uniformity of belief. It requires fairness of judgment, intellectual honesty, and moral courage. And I hope that future conversations about Islam will be shaped less by sensationalism and more by substance, less by reaction and more by reflection. And if my words carry any weight, let them be understood as an appeal for measured dialogue, informed understanding, and mutual dignity. Because Islam, in its essence, calls humanity not toward chaos, but toward order, not toward hatred, but toward mercy, and not toward despair, but toward hope grounded in responsibility. And it is my sincere belief that when Islam is engaged with wisdom and sincerity, it can stand not as a point of division, but as a partner in the shared human pursuit of justice, compassion, and enduring peace.